The blue waters of Velara shimmered under the dying light of their sun. Deep beneath the ocean surface, Ambassador Lyravel swam through the crystal corridors of the Great Archive, her silver fins cutting through the water with desperate urgency. The ancient building had served as the center of Cathari civilization for over 3,000 years, but now it might become their tomb. Lyravel's scaled hands trembled as she approached the massive communication device that connected their world to the galaxy beyond. The machine hummed with power, its bioluminescent panels casting an eerie glow through the water. Around her, dozens of scientists and engineers worked frantically at their stations, their normally calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. The latest readings, Ambassador, called out Chief Scientist Morton, his voice carried by the water's natural acoustics. His report made Lyravel's blood run cold. The star that had given their world life for millions of years was now becoming their executioner. Solar flares had been growing stronger each day, and their calculations showed complete atmospheric failure within 6 months. Lyravel closed her eyes and felt the weight of 2.3 billion lives pressing down on her shoulders. Every Cathari on their world depended on what she did next. Their ships could barely reach their own moons, let alone carry their entire species to safety among the stars. They needed help, and they needed it desperately. She activated the communication array and began broadcasting her message across the galaxy. Her words traveled through space at incredible speeds, reaching dozens of worlds where advanced civilizations had built mighty empires among the stars. The message was simple but heartbreaking. Her people were dying and they had nowhere to run. The response came quickly, but not in the way she had hoped. The Centauran Republic was the first to reply. Their ambassador, a tall being with 4 arms and golden skin, appeared on the communication screen with what might have been sympathy. "We understand your situation," he said in his mechanical voice. "However, the economic cost of such an operation would be enormous. Our resources are already stretched thin with our own colonial expansion projects. We can offer transportation for perhaps 50,000 of your people, but no more. 50,000 out of 2.3 billion. Lyravel felt her hope begin to crack. The Andromedan Trade Federation came next. Their representative, a creature that looked like living crystal, was even more direct. Such an undertaking would require massive ships and years of preparation. The return on investment would be negative. We can provide some emergency supplies and maybe transport for your leadership, but a full evacuation is simply not economically viable." One by one, the great powers of the galaxy gave their answers. The Zephyrian Empire claimed their military was too busy with border disputes. The Cosmic Syndicate offered to buy the mineral rights to Velara after the population was gone. The Ethereal Collective simply didn't respond at all. Each rejection hit Lyravel like a physical blow. She had believed that advanced civilizations would help those in need, that intelligence and technology went hand in hand with compassion. She was learning a hard lesson about the cold reality of galactic politics. Meanwhile, on the other side of the galaxy, Captain Jake Morrison sat in his quarters aboard Luna Station, reading through routine communications from across human space. At 38 years old, he had spent half his life serving in the Terran Deep Space Fleet, fighting in 3 colonial wars and helping establish humanity's first settlements beyond their solar system. Jake's brown eyes scanned through the usual reports until he found something different. A desperate plea from a species he had never heard of, broadcast on an open channel that anyone could receive. The message described a dying world and billions of people who would be dead within months. He called his second-in-command, Commander Lisa Park, to his quarters. Lisa was 10 years younger than Jake, with black hair and sharp intelligence that had earned her rapid promotion through the ranks. She studied the message with the same attention to detail that made her such a valuable officer. "The Cathari," Lisa said, reading from her datapad, "aquatic species, technology level roughly equivalent to Earth 2 centuries ago. They're not part of any major galactic alliance. What about the rescue efforts?" Jake asked. "Surely someone is helping them." Lisa's expression darkened as she pulled up more information. "The major powers have all declined to provide meaningful assistance. The Centaurans offered token help. The Andromedans basically said it would be too expensive. Most others haven't even bothered to respond." Jake stared out the window of his quarters at the blue marble that was Earth, hanging in the void like a precious jewel. He thought about the early days of human space exploration, when their own world had faced environmental disasters and they had pulled together to survive. He thought about the wars he had fought, the colonies they had established, and the dreams they had built among the stars. "Send this to Earth Command," Jake told Lisa. "Priority 1. The message reached Earth's capital within hours, where President Helen Carter was meeting with the Earth Council in emergency session. The massive chamber was filled with representatives from every nation and colony, their faces grim as they discussed what was being called the Cathari crisis. "We barely have enough ships to supply our own colonies," argued Defense Minister Robert Kane. "Getting involved in this could bankrupt us and leave our own people vulnerable." "The economic projections are clear," added Finance Minister Sarah Webb. "A rescue operation of this scale would cost us nearly half our annual budget. We'd have to cut spending on education, infrastructure, and defense for the next decade." But President Carter had been reading the reports from the Galactic networks, learning how other species had simply dismissed the Cathari as not worth saving. She thought about Earth's history, about all the times humans had faced extinction and somehow found a way to survive. She thought about the values that had driven humanity to reach for the stars in the first place. "How many ships can we mobilize?" she asked Admiral Frank Bennett, the gruff 50-year-old commander of Earth's deep space forces. "If we strip every available vessel from patrol duty and convert our industrial haulers," Bennett ran the numbers in his head, "maybe 40 or 50 ships. It won't be pretty, and it'll leave our own space practically undefended." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what the president was considering, and the risks involved. If they committed so many resources to helping the Cathari, Earth would be vulnerable to attack from any number of hostile forces. Their economy would take years to recover. They might even fail completely, leaving both humans and Cathari worse off than before. President Carter stood up from her chair and looked around the room at the faces of humanity's leaders. These were people who had guided their species through wars, disasters, and the challenge of becoming a spacefaring civilization. Now they faced perhaps the most important decision in human history. "I've been reading about how the other species see us," she said quietly. "They call us Deathworlders because we come from a planet they consider impossibly dangerous. They think we're primitive and violent, but I know something they don't understand." She paused, her voice growing stronger. "We didn't become explorers and survivors because our world was safe. We became who we are because when things got impossible, we didn't give up. We didn't abandon each other, and we're not going to start now." The vote wasn't even close. Within 6 hours, every available ship in human space was being prepared for the longest rescue mission in galactic history. Jake Morrison found himself promoted to admiral and placed in command of the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled. As the ships began gathering at the edge of human space, preparing for the jump to Cathari territory, Jake stood on the bridge of his flagship and wondered if they were about to attempt the impossible. But then he remembered the message from Liravel, the desperate plea of a species facing extinction, and he knew they had to try. The Deathworlders were coming to help. 3 weeks had passed since the Cathari sent their desperate message across the galaxy. Most species had written them off as doomed, another primitive civilization that would disappear into history. The galactic news networks had moved on to other stories, and the major powers had returned to their usual business of trade and politics. Then space itself seemed to tear open at the edge of the Velara system. The first ship to emerge from hyperspace was massive, its hull scarred from countless battles and retrofitted with equipment that looked jury-rigged but functional. The UES Defiant, flagship of the Terran Deep Space Fleet, hung in space like a metal mountain against the stars. Behind it came another ship, then another, until space was filled with vessels of every size and shape. Admiral Frank Bennett stood on the bridge of the Defiant, watching as his fleet completed their jump into Cathari space. 47 ships in total, from massive colony vessels hastily converted from industrial haulers to swift medical frigates that had been pulled from hospital duty across human space. It was the largest rescue fleet ever assembled in recorded galactic history, and it belonged to a species that most of the galaxy considered primitive Deathworlders. "Long-range sensors are picking up the Cathari homeworld," reported Lieutenant Commander Pete Walsh from his station. "Solar radiation levels are already climbing past safe limits for most species." Bennett nodded grimly. The star that had given life to Velara for millions of years was now pumping out deadly energy that would kill anyone who got too close. Anyone except humans, whose evolution on a radiation-blasted world had given them natural resistance that other species lacked. On the planet's surface, Ambassador Lyra Vel received word that ships had arrived in their system. She swam frantically to the communication center, hardly daring to believe what her scientists were telling her. When the images came through showing dozens of vessels moving toward their world, she felt her heart skip several beats. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The identification signals say they're from Earth," replied Chief Scientist Morton, his own voice filled with disbelief. "Humans? The Deathworlders?" Lyra Vel stared at the screen. She had heard of humans, of course. Everyone in the galaxy knew about the violent species that had somehow survived on a world so dangerous that most civilized beings couldn't last an hour on its surface. They were newcomers to galactic society, barely 15 years since first contact, and generally ignored by the major powers as irrelevant. Yet here they were with more ships than the Centauran Republic had in their entire rescue service. Aboard the UES Ranger, Dr. Amy Rodriguez was having the worst day of her scientific career, and she had never been happier about it. The 35-year-old xenobiologist had been given an impossible task: figure out how to transport 2.3 billion aquatic beings whose biology was completely different from anything humans had encountered before. "The water temperature has to be exactly 22 degrees, she muttered to herself, reviewing the data streaming in from Cathari scientists. Salinity levels that would kill most fish, pressure requirements that change based on their age, and they need specific minerals that exist only in their ocean. Chief Engineer Carlos Martinez floated beside her in the zero gravity of the cargo bay they were converting into a refugee transport area. At 42, he was old enough to have worked on the first human colony ships, and his experience was proving invaluable. "We can modify the atmospheric processors to handle the water recycling," he said, pointing to the massive tanks they were installing. "The real problem is space. Even if we pack them in tight, we can maybe fit 50,000 per ship. That's only 2 million total, and we need to move over 2 billion. Amy felt the weight of impossible mathematics crushing down on her. Even if they worked perfectly and nothing went wrong, they could only save 1 out of every 1,000 Cathari. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. That was when Captain Jake Morrison's voice came over the communication system with news that changed everything. "All ships, this is Admiral Morrison. Long-range sensors have detected a problem. The star's instability has increased beyond all predictions. We don't have 6 months anymore. We have maybe 6 weeks before the radiation becomes lethal to all life on the planet." The silence that followed was deafening. Amy felt her stomach drop as the implications hit her. 6 weeks to evacuate 2.3 billion people with equipment designed to handle maybe 2 million. The mathematics had gone from impossible to absolutely hopeless, but Jake Morrison hadn't become an admiral by accepting hopeless situations. "I'm taking Squadron 7 directly into the radiation zone to establish orbital platforms," he announced. "We'll set up evacuation points in close orbit to cut transport time by 70%. All volunteers for radiation duty, report to your commanding officers." What happened next surprised even Jake. Every single human in the fleet volunteered for radiation duty. Pilots who should have been safely transporting refugees offered to fly into the death zone around Velara. Engineers volunteered to work on platforms that would be constantly bathed in deadly energy. Medical personnel requested assignment to the orbital stations where they would treat radiation sickness while being exposed to it. Themselves, Dr. Amy Rodriguez found herself assigned to the most dangerous platform, orbiting barely 300 miles above Velthara's surface. The radiation levels would have killed most galactic species within hours, but humans could work there for days before needing medical treatment. As she prepared for transport to the platform, Amy received a priority message from Earth. It was from her daughter, Jenny, a 12-year-old girl who had watched the news reports about the rescue mission. "Mom," the message said, "I know it's dangerous where you're going, but Sarah at school said her dad thinks you're all crazy for trying to save aliens who can't even help themselves. I told her that's exactly why you have to help them, because nobody else will. I'm proud of you, Mom." Amy wiped tears from her eyes and prepared to risk her life for people she had never met. People who lived in oceans on a world she might never see again. Meanwhile, the galactic community was watching the human rescue effort with a mixture of amazement and skeptical anticipation of failure. In the crystal palaces of the Andromedan Trade Federation, Council Chairman Velara reviewed the latest reports with his advisors. They've actually managed to establish orbital platforms in a radiation zone that would be instantly fatal to our species, reported his military advisor. Their ships are operating in conditions that would destroy our best vessels. Impressive, Velara admitted grudgingly, but ultimately pointless. Even if they somehow survive the radiation, the logistics are impossible. They simply don't have enough ships or time to evacuate that many beings. When they fail, it will prove why we don't waste resources on hopeless causes. Similar conversations were happening across the galaxy. The Centauran Republic's senators privately discussed how human failure would reinforce their own decision not to attempt a rescue. The Zephyrian Empire's military leaders analyzed human tactics with professional interest, while expecting ultimate defeat. But on Velara, something was happening that the galactic powers hadn't expected. The Cathari themselves were responding to human courage with their own determination. Instead of panicking as their world slowly died around them, they began organizing evacuation efforts with military precision. Cathari engineer Velara worked alongside human technician Danny Price to solve the water recycling problem. Their breakthrough came when they realized they could use Velthara's own mineral-rich seawater as a base, then modify it using human technology to create the perfect environment for transport. Your people are risking their lives for us, Velara told Danny as they worked together in the flooded lower levels of an industrial complex. We will not waste their sacrifice by failing to do our part. As the first evacuation ships filled with refugees and began the journey to safety, Ambassador Lyra received reports from around her world. Humans were working in radiation levels that should have been impossible to survive. They were modifying their ships in ways that violated every safety protocol to carry more refugees. They were giving up their own living space, their food, even their water rations to make room for more Cathari, and they were dying for it. The first casualty report came in just 5 days after the rescue began. 3 humans lost to radiation exposure while manually repairing a damaged evacuation platform. They had refused to abandon their posts even when ordered to evacuate, staying long enough to save 2,000 Cathari refugees. That night, Lyra sent a message to Earth, not to the government or the military, but directly to the families of those who had died. She wanted them to know that their sacrifice had meaning. The 2.3 billion Cathari would remember 3 humans who chose to die rather than let strangers perish. The rescue was just beginning, but already it was changing everything, not just for the Cathari who might survive, but for every species watching a group of supposedly primitive Deathworlders attempt the impossible, simply because it was the right thing to do. The evacuation had been running for 2 weeks, and the humans were learning what it truly meant to work in hell. The radiation around Velara had increased to levels that would kill most galactic species in minutes, but the human crews continued their work in shifts, taking turns absorbing doses of deadly energy that accumulated in their bodies like poison. Lieutenant Commander Pete Walsh floated in the airlock of his modified transport ship, checking his radiation suit one more time before diving into the toxic waters of a Cathari city. The suit looked like it had been cobbled together from spare parts, because it had been. Human engineers had worked around the clock to create gear that could protect their crews while allowing them to work directly with the aquatic aliens. Remember, 15 minutes maximum exposure. Dr. Amy Rodriguez's voice crackled through his helmet radio. She was monitoring radiation levels from the orbital platform, her own body already showing the early signs of radiation sickness despite the treatments. Your cumulative dose is already approaching dangerous levels. Pete ignored the warning, just like he had ignored the previous dozen warnings. His team of Marines, including Sergeants Maria Santos and Tony Clark, were working with Cathari emergency responders to evacuate the deep ocean settlements that were hardest to reach. These weren't the wealthy or important Cathari who lived in the easily accessible cities. These were the poor, the old, and the sick who lived in the deepest parts of the ocean, where the water pressure would crush most beings. "We've got another group of elderly civilians down here," Maria's voice came through the radio. Her breathing was labored, a sign that the radiation was affecting her lungs. Maybe 200 individuals, but they're too weak to make the swim to the transport zone. Pete made a decision that would have horrified any safety officer. He ordered his team to manually carry each elderly Cathari to the surface, one by one, through water that was becoming more radioactive by the hour. It took 6 trips, and by the end, all 3 Marines were vomiting blood into their helmets, but 200 more lives were saved. On the orbital platform, Dr. Rodriguez was making discoveries that were revolutionizing interspecies medicine, though she might not live long enough to see them implemented. Her breakthrough came when she was treating a young Cathari who had been exposed to radiation during the evacuation. The alien was dying, and none of their medical techniques were working. In desperation, Amy tried something that should have been impossible. She took treated human blood plasma and carefully introduced it into the Cathari system. The theory was based on humans' natural radiation resistance, and it should have killed the patient immediately due to biological incompatibility. Instead, the young Cathari began to recover. Within hours, Amy had proven that human blood plasma, when properly filtered and treated, could temporarily boost Cathari resistance to radiation poisoning. The discovery spread through the fleet like wildfire, and soon every human who was physically able was donating blood to save alien lives. The donation process was dangerous. Humans were already weakened by radiation exposure, and losing blood made them even more vulnerable. But volunteer after volunteer lined up at the medical stations, rolling up their sleeves to give their life force to complete strangers. Chief Engineer Carlos Martinez was one of the donors, even though he was desperately needed to keep the evacuation ships running. His hands shook from radiation sickness as he worked on a damaged water recycling system, but he refused to stop working. "Sir, you need medical attention," his assistant Danny Price told him for the 5th time that day. Danny was barely 25 and had never seen combat, but the young engineer was proving himself under the worst possible conditions. "The recycling system breaks down. We lose the ability to transport 10,000 refugees per hour," Carlos replied, his voice hoarse from the toxic atmosphere. "I can rest when they're all safe." The 2 engineers worked side by side with Cathari technician Velara, who had become something of a legend among her own people. She was one of the few Cathari who could survive in the increasingly toxic surface waters long enough to help with technical repairs. Her collaboration with the humans had produced innovations that were saving thousands of lives every day. "Your species continues to amaze us," Velara told Danny as they jury-rigged another transport tank. "We have watched the Galactic networks. Other species discuss your mission with predictions of failure. They say you are too primitive, too emotional to succeed at such a complex operation." Danny managed a weak smile despite his nausea. Maybe being emotional isn't such a bad thing. At least it means we care enough to try. Their conversation was interrupted by an emergency alert that sent ice through every human's veins. Long-range sensors had detected a massive solar flare building in Velthara's sun, bigger than anything they had recorded before. When it hit, it would destroy anything in orbit around the planet and make the surface completely uninhabitable. Captain Jake Morrison, now suffering from advanced radiation sickness that left him pale and weak, received the report on his flagship. The numbers were terrifying. They had maybe 18 hours before the flare hit, and there were still 800,000 Cathari on the planet's surface. "All ships, this is Admiral Morrison," he announced over the fleet communication system. "We're facing a Category 5 solar event in less than 20 hours. I'm ordering all non-essential personnel to evacuate to minimum safe distance. What happened next would be talked about in military academies for centuries to come. Not a single human evacuated. Instead, they doubled their efforts, working at a pace that should have been impossible for beings already dying from radiation exposure. The evacuation platforms, which had been taking carefully calculated risks, began operating far beyond their safety margins. Ships that should have maintained safe distances moved closer to the planet to cut transport time. Human crews who should have been in medical treatment continued working, knowing that each minute might be their last. Dr. Rodriguez made perhaps the most difficult decision of her life. With the solar flare approaching, she had to choose between evacuating the orbital medical station or staying to treat the refugees who were still being brought up from the surface. The station would be completely destroyed when the flare hit. She chose to stay. So did her entire medical staff. If we evacuate now, 3,000 injured Cathari will die, she told her team. We can save most of them if we keep working for another 12 hours. That gives us 6 hours to get to minimum safe distance before the flare hits. It was a desperate gamble with almost no chance of success. But her staff voted unanimously to stay and keep working. Meanwhile, the Galactic community was watching the unfolding disaster with growing amazement and horror. In the crystal towers of the Andromedan Trade Federation, emergency meetings were being held as reports came in of human ships operating in radiation levels that should have been instantly fatal. Their casualties are approaching 50%, reported military advisor Zenthak. Any rational species would have withdrawn by now. Their entire rescue fleet is going to be destroyed. But Council Chairman Vex Mora was beginning to understand something that would change his entire worldview. They're not trying to preserve their fleet, he said quietly. They're trying to save every last refugee, even if it costs them everything. For the first time in his long career, the Andromedan leader felt something that his species had forgotten centuries ago. Shame. His people had the ships and resources to help with this rescue, but they had chosen economic pragmatism over moral obligation. Now he was watching a supposedly primitive species sacrifice themselves for strangers, and it made him question everything he believed about civilization. The solar flare was building to unprecedented levels, and time was running out. On Velthara's surface, the last evacuation teams were working frantically to reach the most remote settlements. The water around them glowed with radiation, and their equipment was beginning to fail from the intense energy bombardment. Sergeant Maria Santos led her team into what everyone knew was a suicide mission. Deep in the ocean trenches, a group of Cathari children had been trapped when their transport broke down. The water pressure at that depth would crush most rescue equipment, and the radiation levels would kill anyone within minutes. "I'm going down," Maria announced, ignoring the protests from her team. "Those kids aren't dying on my watch." She made the dive alone, her radiation suit systems failing one by one as she descended into the toxic depths. The children she found were barely alive, huddled together in the wreckage of their transport. Maria managed to get them into her emergency pods and send them to the surface before her suit finally gave out completely. She never made it back up. But 8 Cathari children lived because one human marine decided that their lives were worth more than her own. As the solar flare reached critical intensity and the last evacuation ships prepared to flee to safety, the humans had achieved something that the rest of the galaxy had declared impossible. They had evacuated 2.2 million Cathari from a world that was about to become uninhabitable, but they had paid a terrible price. Over 400 humans were dead or dying from radiation exposure, and many more would never fully recover. The massive solar flare had passed, leaving Velthara's surface a burned wasteland of boiling oceans and poisoned air. The evacuation fleet limped away from the dead world with 2.2 million Cathari refugees crammed into ships that were falling apart around them. It should have been a moment of victory, but Admiral Frank Bennett knew they had only won half the battle. Deep in the ocean trenches that the solar flare hadn't been able to reach, 500,000 Cathari still lived in underground cities powered by geothermal vents. They were safe from the radiation for now, but their food supplies would last only 2 more weeks. After that, they would slowly starve to death in their underwater refuges. Bennett stood in the medical bay of his flagship, watching Dr. Amy Rodriguez treat human casualties who looked more like walking corpses than living soldiers. Half his fleet was in the same condition, their ships barely functional and their crews dying from radiation exposure. Any sane commander would have declared the mission complete and taken his survivors home. But Bennett wasn't feeling particularly sane, and neither were his people. "What do you need to go back?" he asked Dr. Rodriguez as she finished treating another radiation victim. Amy looked up at him with eyes that were bloodshot from exposure to toxic gases. Her hands shook as she set down her medical instruments, but her voice was steady. "We need ships that can survive in that radiation soup, and we need them fast. Our current vessels won't last another day in that environment." "Then we make new ones," Bennett said simply. The plan that followed would have been called impossible by any military academy in the galaxy. Every human ship would be stripped of everything, except essential life support and engines. Armor plating would be removed and replaced with lead shielding, salvaged from the ship's reactors. Crew quarters would be eliminated entirely to make room for refugees. Even the bridge crews would work in doubled-up shifts to create more space for evacuees. Chief Engineer Carlos Martinez took charge of the ship modifications, despite the fact that he could barely stand without assistance. His radiation sickness had progressed to the point where he was coughing up blood, but he refused medical evacuation. "We're going to turn every ship into a flying refugee camp," he explained to his exhausted engineering teams. "No creature comforts, no safety margins, no backup systems. Everything gets sacrificed to carry more people." The work began immediately, with human crews tearing apart their own ships in a race against time. They had maybe 10 days before the Cathari survivors ran out of food, and the modifications would take at least a week to complete. Meanwhile, Captain Jake Morrison was planning what everyone knew would be a suicide mission. His ship, the UES Ranger, would lead a small squadron back to Velthara's surface to establish new evacuation points. The radiation levels were now beyond anything humans had ever survived, but someone had to go down and coordinate the rescue of the deep-water survivors. "Sir, the medical projections are clear," his second-in-command, Commander Lisa Park, told him privately. "Anyone who goes back to that planet will be dead within 72 hours. The radiation will cook them from the inside out." Jake nodded. He had read the same reports. "Then we better work fast," he said. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Cathari engineer Theara, working with human technician Danny Price, had been studying the damaged industrial platforms that floated in Velthara's poisoned oceans. These massive structures had been built to survive underwater volcanic eruptions and were still partially intact despite the solar flare. "We can use them," Theara explained excitedly to the human engineering teams. "Your engines are industrial platforms. We create massive Ark ships that can carry hundreds of thousands in a single journey." The idea was brilliant and terrifying. The Cathari platforms were huge, but they had never been designed for space travel. Attaching human engines and life support systems would require precise engineering under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. The work would have to be done on Velthara's surface, in the middle of a radiation storm that was getting worse by the hour. Dr. Rodriguez made another breakthrough when she realized that the human blood plasma treatments could be scaled up dramatically. By setting up mobile blood collection units, they could process donations from the entire fleet and create enough plasma to protect thousands of Cathari during transport through the radiation zones. "We're asking people who are already dying from radiation exposure to give up more of their blood," she warned Admiral Bennett. "It's going to kill some of them." Bennett looked around at his crew, men and women who had already given up everything to save strangers from across the galaxy. "Put out the call for volunteers," he said. "Let them decide for themselves." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every human in the fleet who was physically able volunteered to donate blood, even those who were already critically ill from radiation sickness. The medical staff had to turn people away, because there simply weren't enough collection units to handle all the volunteers. On Velthara's surface, the work began to attach human engines to Cathari industrial platforms. The teams working on the project could only spend minutes on the surface before the radiation forced them to retreat, so the work progressed in tiny increments. Marines would sprint out of their ships, make a few welds or connections, then rush back before the toxic atmosphere killed them. Sergeant Tony Clark led one of these teams, his body already failing from the cumulative radiation exposure. His squad worked in relay fashion, with each Marine taking turns running into the death zone to complete small sections of work. They were literally dying to attach engines to platforms that might not even work. The Galactic community watched these efforts with growing amazement and horror. The Crystalline Collective, who had remained completely silent during the initial crisis, suddenly broke their traditional isolation and offered their fastest ships to help transport the most critically injured refugees to medical facilities. "We have observed the human efforts with great interest," announced their crystal-like ambassador in an unprecedented public statement. "Their actions have caused us to reconsider our policy of non-interference. We offer our assistance to preserve these lives that have been saved through such sacrifice." Even the Andromedan Trade Federation, who had initially dismissed the rescue as economically impossible, began quietly redirecting resources to help with refugee resettlement. Council Chairman Vex Mora privately admitted to his advisors that witnessing the human rescue effort had fundamentally changed his understanding of what it meant to be civilized. But the real miracle was happening on Velara itself, where human engineering teams were somehow succeeding in their impossible task. Working in shifts that lasted only minutes at a time, they managed to attach engines and life support systems to 3 massive Cathari platforms. The jury-rigged Ark ships looked like disasters waiting to happen, but they were capable of carrying 200,000 refugees each. The first test launch almost ended in catastrophe. The platform's structural integrity was marginal. The engines were barely powerful enough to achieve orbit, and the life support systems were operating far beyond their design limits. But the Ark ship made it to space carrying 200,000 Cathari, who had been given up for dead. Captain Morrison, his body now showing the final stages of radiation poisoning, personally piloted the lead ship in the evacuation of the last deepwater settlements. His crew was in similar condition, barely able to stand at their stations, but they continued working with the determination that had defined the entire rescue operation. Dr. Jane Phillips, the chief medical officer aboard Morrison's ship, had transformed her sickbay into a combination hospital and refugee processing center. She worked alongside Cathari medical personnel to treat both species, sharing techniques and medications that were saving lives on both sides. "Captain, your radiation levels are approaching fatal doses," she warned Morrison during one of his brief medical checkups. "How long do I have?" he asked simply. "Maybe 48 hours before organ failure becomes irreversible." Morrison nodded and returned to the bridge. There were still 100,000 Cathari in the deepest settlements, and someone had to coordinate their rescue. The final evacuation took place in conditions that defied all scientific understanding of what humans could survive. The modified Ark ships made trip after trip to the planet's surface, each journey bringing them closer to complete structural failure. Human crews worked in environmental suits that were more radiation than protection, their life support systems failing one by one. With only hours left before the platforms would be too damaged to make another trip, the last transport left Velthara's surface. Captain Morrison's skeleton crew had stayed behind to ensure every single Cathari made it to safety, and they barely managed to launch their own ship before the radiation finally overwhelmed their shields completely. As the final rescue ship limped away from the dead world, Admiral Bennett looked at the casualty reports and felt a mixture of pride and grief that would stay with him for the rest of his life. 847 humans had been killed or critically injured during the rescue operation, including 23 deaths from direct radiation exposure. 6 months had passed since the last transport ship limped away from the dying world of Velara. The galaxy had watched in stunned silence as humanity accomplished what every major civilization had declared impossible. Now, as representatives from across known space gathered in the Great Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council, the true impact of that rescue was about to reshape the political landscape forever. Captain Jake Morrison stood at the witness podium, his body still bearing the permanent marks of radiation exposure that had nearly killed him. His hair had turned completely white, his hands shook slightly when he wasn't concentrating, and the doctors said he would never fully recover from what the rescue mission had done to his body. But he was alive, and more importantly, so were 2.3 billion Cathari who should have died on their poisoned homeworld. Beside him stood Ambassador Lyra, representing her people in their first formal address to the Galactic Council. Her silver scales seemed to shimmer under the assembly hall's lights as she prepared to make an announcement that would change everything. "Honored members of the Council," she began, her translated words carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "6 months ago, my people sent a desperate plea for help across the galaxy. We were told by many of your governments that saving us was economically impossible, logistically unfeasible, and strategically unwise." The chamber fell completely silent. Representatives from dozens of species shifted uncomfortably in their seats, knowing exactly where this speech was heading. "Only one species answered our call," Lyra continued. "The humans, whom many of you dismiss as primitive Deathworlders, mobilized their entire deep space fleet to save people they had never met. They risked everything, lost hundreds of their own people, and nearly bankrupted their entire civilization to give us a chance at life. She paused, letting her words sink in before delivering the announcement that would send shockwaves through galactic politics. Today, the Cathari Republic formally announces our complete alliance with Earth. We place our technology, our resources, and our loyalty at the service of humanity. Furthermore, we are establishing our primary settlement in human space on the world they have terraformed for us and named New Velara. The political implications hit the assembly like a tidal wave. The Cathari were master biotechnicians, their medical and environmental technologies among the most advanced in the galaxy. Their formal alliance with humanity instantly elevated Earth from a minor frontier power to a major galactic player, but Liravel wasn't finished. We also announced the formation of the Terran Cathari Medical Cooperative, she said. Dr. Amy Rodriguez of Earth and Dr. Mortan of our people have successfully combined human and Cathari medical techniques to develop revolutionary treatments for radiation exposure, genetic damage, and cellular regeneration. These treatments will be made freely available to any species that commits to mutual aid agreements. In the audience, Dr. Amy Rodriguez felt tears running down her cheeks. The woman who had nearly died developing emergency medical techniques in a radiation storm was now being recognized as the founder of an entirely new field of interspecies medicine. The treatments she had developed were already saving lives across the galaxy. Admiral Frank Bennett, now serving as Earth's military representative to the Galactic Council, watched the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. His battered rescue fleet had been rebuilt and expanded, but more importantly, 12 other species had formally requested mutual defense agreements with humanity. The Deathworlders were no longer alone in the galaxy. The real shock came when representatives began standing up around the assembly hall. First, the Crystalline ambassador from the collective rose to speak. The Crystalline Collective formally requests a mutual aid agreement with Earth, the being announced, its voice resonating like musical chimes. We have observed that true civilization is not measured by technological advancement or economic power, but by the willingness to help those in need. The Zephyrian Empire's representative was next. We offer our fastest ships and most skilled pilots to join any future humanitarian missions led by Earth. One by one, species that had either ignored the Cathari plea or offered only token assistance now stood to pledge their support to the humans who had shown them what moral leadership actually looked like. Even some members of the Andromedan Trade Federation broke ranks to offer individual support. Despite their government's official position, the most significant moment came when Council Chairman Vex Mora of the Andromedan Trade Federation requested permission to speak. The golden-skinned leader had been one of the most vocal critics of the rescue mission, calling it economically irresponsible and strategically pointless. 6 months ago, I believed that advanced civilizations had moved beyond such primitive emotional responses as risking everything to save strangers, Vex Mora said, his mechanical voice carrying a tone that many had never heard from him before. I was wrong. The humans have shown us that our technological advancement means nothing if we have lost our capacity for compassion. He paused, looking directly at Captain Morrison. I formally apologize to the human delegation and to the Cathari people for my government's failure to provide assistance. The Andromedan Trade Federation will be contributing significant resources to the new Interspecies Aid Alliance that Earth is proposing. The Interspecies Aid Alliance was Admiral Bennett's brainchild, a mutual defense and rescue organization that would ensure no species ever faced extinction alone again. The Alliance's charter was simple. Any member species facing disaster would receive immediate aid from all other members, regardless of economic cost or political complications. By the end of the session, 17 species had signed preliminary agreements to join the Alliance. The old order of galactic politics based on economic pragmatism and species isolation was crumbling before their eyes. 3 years later, Captain Morrison stood on the observation deck of the UES Defiant, watching children play in the specially designed pools of New Velara. Human children and young Cathari swam together in crystal-clear water that maintained the perfect temperature and mineral content for both species. It was a sight that would have been impossible before the rescue mission. Chief Engineer Carlos Martinez, now serving as the colony's infrastructure coordinator, approached Morrison with his daily report. The older man moved slowly, his body still recovering from the radiation damage, but his eyes were bright with satisfaction. "The Joint Research Facility is ahead of schedule," Martinez reported. "Dr. Rodriguez and the Cathari medical team have developed another breakthrough in cellular regeneration therapy. They think they can reverse some types of genetic damage that we thought were permanent." Morrison nodded, remembering the dark days when half his crew was dying from radiation poisoning, and they weren't sure if anyone would survive the mission. Now those same people were leading revolutionary advances in medicine that were helping species across the galaxy. The communication console chimed with an incoming priority message. Morrison recognized the signal pattern immediately. It was another distress call, this time from a species facing invasion by hostile machine intelligences on the far side of the galaxy. The response was swift and overwhelming. 17 different species volunteered ships and crews for the rescue mission within hours. The Crystalline Collective offered their most advanced vessels. The Zephyrian Empire provided military escorts. Even former isolationist species contributed resources to help people they had never met. The transformation was complete. The rescue of the Cathari had created a new model for galactic civilization, one based on mutual aid rather than economic competition. The species that had once dismissed humans as primitive Deathworlders now looked to them for moral leadership in times of crisis. Dr. Amy Rodriguez, now serving as the first director of the Galactic Medical Cooperative, received regular reports from colonies across known space where her techniques were saving lives. The emergency treatments developed in the chaos of a radiation storm had evolved into standard medical procedures used by dozens of species. Ambassador Lyra Vell had become one of the most respected voices in galactic politics, often called upon to mediate disputes between species. Her people's gratitude to humanity had evolved into a genuine partnership that was producing innovations in biotechnology, environmental management, and interspecies cooperation. But perhaps the most significant change was in how the galaxy viewed the concept of impossible odds. When the next major crisis arose, and there would always be another crisis, species across the galaxy would remember the lesson taught by a group of humans who refused to accept that saving 2.3 billion lives was economically unfeasible. As Morrison watched the sunset over New Velthara, he thought about the message that had started it all, a desperate plea for aid from strangers on a dying world, ignored by the great powers of the galaxy, until a group of Deathworlders decided that every life was worth saving. Regardless of the cost, the rescue fleet had returned home battered and broken, carrying refugees and casualties in equal measure, but they had also carried something more valuable. Proof that civilization's greatest strength wasn't in its technology or wealth, but in its willingness to help those in need.